Ever get that feeling where you are just completely locked in?
Yeah.
Like maybe you're trying to master a new level in a game
Right.
or just completely absorbed in figuring something out and hours can just fly by.
Yeah.
And that same focus, that drive to learn and improve, I mean, contrast that to sitting in a classroom.
Right.
And for many, it's a completely different story,
Yeah.
minds wandering, struggling to connect with the material.
Yeah.
This kind of head-scratching puzzle, this digital paradox, as it's sometimes called, that we're diving deep into today.
Right.
So,
I think it's a really fascinating topic. And we've got this really interesting article as our guide today.
okay.
From active gamers to passive learners, rewiring the classroom for self-driven learning.
Okay.
And it's by Shiva Narayan Taxshila. And our goal today is to kind of understand the why behind this contrast.
Yeah.
Why that gamer focus so often disappears in a learning setting. And then look at the framework that the article lays out, which is built around something called brainpage theory and system learnography as potential ways to bridge this gap.
So fascinating. And for our listeners, especially those who I know, value getting to the core of things quickly and effectively.
Absolutely.
I mean, this disconnect, I think, has really got to resonate with you.
Yeah.
You've likely felt that incredible focus in some parts of your life. And the exciting thing is the very things that make those experiences so engaging may hold the key to unlocking that same level of motivation and learning in other areas without leaving you feeling buried under information.
Absolutely.
So I think a great place to start would be to just define this so-called digital paradox that the article highlights.
Okay. Yeah.
When we look at students as active gamers, what are some of the defining characteristics that Taxshila points out? What makes them so engaged?
Well, I mean, the level of focus, first of all, I think is just incredible. They can concentrate for, extended periods.
Yeah.
They're also very autonomous. Like they explore the game world, they experiment.
Yeah.
They're figuring things out on their own.
Right.
They're quick learners.
Yeah.
They adapt to new rules and challenges.
Yeah.
And then just think about the sheer amount of practice.
Right.
They're doing the same actions over and over again.
Yeah.
Not because they have to,
Right.
but because they want to get better.
Exactly.
So that drive for improvement is really key there.
Right.
And it's fueled by something internal.
It is. It is.
So what else does he note about them as gamers?
Strategic thinking is huge.
Yeah.
They're constantly analyzing situations, planning their moves, problem solving in real time.
Absolutely.
And perhaps most interestingly, I think they show a lot of resilience.
Yeah.
They face setbacks.
Yeah.
They fail in the game.
Right.
But they keep trying.
Right.
They learn from those mistakes. And they persist.
Yeah.
So now when we look at those same individuals as passive learners in a traditional classroom setting, the article paints a very different picture.
Yeah. I mean, the contrast is really stark.
Yeah.
As passive learners, they often become very dependent on the teacher for direction and answers. That intrinsic motivation we saw in gaming seems to be absent. They struggle to retain information. Their understanding might be surface level, and focusing becomes a real hurdle.
It does.
And they often rely on external rewards like grades or the fear of negative consequences to stay somewhat engaged.
It's almost hard to believe it's the same person in both scenarios.
It is, yeah.
And this really gets to the heart of that central question that the article poses.
Right.
If these students are capable of such deep engagement in games, what's preventing that same level of involvement in their academic learning?
Yeah, and the article makes this really strong case that the answer lies in the learning environment itself. So think about what makes a gaming environment so captivating.
Yeah.
What are the core elements that keep players hooked?
Well, I think games are usually designed to offer this really compelling balance between the level of challenge and your current skill. It's that just right zone that keeps you in flow.
Yeah.
You also get immediate feedback on your actions.
Right.
Instantly if what you did worked, and often why there's that strong sense of control.
Yeah, you have agency.
You have agency within the game.
Yeah.
And you can clearly see your progress, those little victories along the way that trigger the brain's reward system.
Absolutely.
And the article even specifically mentions the substantia nigra, which releases dopamine.
Right.
Which is that same chemical that makes achieving goals in the game feel so rewarding.
Yeah, I mean, that instant feedback loop and the visible sense of advancement are just so crucial.
Yeah.
Now, compare that to the landscape of conventional education, as the article describes it.
Right.
Where does it fall short in providing those elements?
Well, the article points out several key differences.
Okay.
One is that traditional education often employs this one-size-fits-all curriculum.
Yeah.
That doesn't really cater to individual interests or paces. There's also a huge emphasis on cognitive instruction.
Yeah.
Lots of lecturing and passive listening.
Right.
Rather than learning through doing through experience.
Right.
Feedback is often delayed and not very specific.
Yeah.
So you may not know how you're really doing until you reach a big assessment. And student autonomy was often limited with a strong focus on grades as that main driver, rather than the inherent satisfaction of learning.
And as a result, the article suggests students lose that sense of ownership and genuine interest, leading them to become more like passive recipients of information rather than active participants. Yeah. And I think the article says it really powerfully.
Yeah.
Passive learners are self-driven gamers.
That's huge.
Like, that ability is there, it's just not being tapped into in that traditional classroom.
It's not a lack of ability to focus, but rather a mismatch between the environment and how our brain naturally engages.
Yeah.
And so this brings us to the article's proposed solution.
Okay.
Brainpage theory and system learnography.
Right.
So let's start with brainpage theory in the simplest terms. What's the core idea here?
So brainpage theory suggests that learning isn't just about absorbing information intellectually.
Okay.
It's much more of an embodied process involving our physical actions, our movements, as well as visual processing and those higher level executive functions of the brain. And the idea is that through active engagement, we create these more robust and lasting neurological imprints.
Okay, so it's not just about hearing something and trying to remember it.
Right.
But it's about engaging multiple senses and our physical selves in the learning process to create these stronger brain pages.
Exactly.
And from this understanding, the article discusses cultivating two types of learners, self-driven and self-directed.
Yeah.
So what's the distinction between those two?
So self-driven learners are the ones who are intrinsically motivated.
Okay.
They're fueled by their own curiosity. They enjoy a good challenge. They have this natural desire to improve.
Wow.
They're the students that will often explore beyond what's required and thrive when they have more control over their learning.
Okay.
Self-directed learners, on the other hand, take this much more active role in managing their own learning journey.
Okay.
So they set their own learning objectives.
Okay.
They plan how they're going to learn. They monitor their progress.
Right.
They evaluate their understanding. The article mentions cyclizide rehearsal as a key technique that self-directed learners use.
Okay.
And this is kind of like spaced repetition.
Okay.
But with a very specific cyclical structure that the article details.
Gotcha.
To really solidify what they've learned. And so this idea of the happiness classroom within the Taxshila model, all powered by system learnography, is designed to help both of these types of learners flourish. It's about designing a learning environment where that innate drive and the skills for managing one's own learning can really take hold.
So let's shift gears a little bit and look at how traditional education, according to the article, can unintentionally hinder this natural inclination towards self-driven and self-directed learning.
Right.
And actually contribute to students becoming passive.
Yeah.
So this was a really interesting part of the article for me.
Yeah.
It points to several ways that traditional classrooms can inadvertently manufacture passivity. So one key aspect is this idea of verbal overload.
Yeah.
That most instruction is delivered through lectures.
Right.
Primarily engaging the auditory and linguistic parts of the brain.
Which limits the ways the brain can process and store information.
Right. We're not engaging enough of those sensory and motor systems.
Right. Exactly.
And then there's often a lack of hands-on practice.
Yeah.
Students may not get enough opportunities to physically interact with the material.
Yeah.
Through writing things down, drawing diagrams, manipulating objects, actually doing things.
And the article specifically highlights the lack of motor involvement.
Yeah.
And this isn't just about needing to move around if you're restless.
Right.
It suggests that physical movement and interaction are actually fundamental to deeper cognitive processing and forming those brain pages.
Exactly.
And then there's the issue of motivation.
Yes.
Traditional classrooms often rely on these external pressures.
Right.
Like grades and fear of failing, rather than tapping into that intrinsic curiosity and genuine interest in the subject matter.
And so the result, as the article argues, is the development of passivity.
Yeah.
A dependence on the teacher for all the answers.
Yeah.
A lack of real engagement.
Right.
And ultimately a failure to create those strong, lasting brain page modules that lead to long-term understanding and retention.
Exactly, yeah.
So if that's the problem, then what's the alternative that's offered by system learnography?
So system learnography is this pretty significant shift in approach.
Right.
And at its core, it's about making the student's brain the central driver of learning rather than solely relying on teacher-led instruction.
Okay.
And it really emphasizes integrating the motor science of learning, which is the idea that physical activity enhances learning with the principles of neuroplasticity, which is the brain's incredible ability to rewire itself based on experiences. And it circles back to that brain page theory, reinforcing that learning is about creating those neurological imprints, those brain page maps and modules, through both mental and physical activity.
So this motor science of learning is a key part of system learnography.
Absolutely.
It's not just about passively absorbing information.
It's not, no. It stresses the importance of things like writing by hand, using gestures to explain concepts, manipulating objects. So these kinds of activities actually activate these deeper areas of the brain, and they really help to solidify knowledge in a more tangible way. And then there's this thing called the SOTIM framework, which stands for space, object, time, instance, and module.
Oh, wow.
And this is basically a way for learners to kind of organize and connect what they're learning in this more spatial and temporal context.
So give me an example of how that would work.
Yeah. So, for example, when you're learning about a historical event, that would be the instance. You might consider its geographical location. That's space. Key artifacts from that period, that's object, its place in the timeline, that's time. And how it fits into these broader historical concepts or module.
That's really interesting. It sounds like that could make abstract ideas much more concrete.
It can,
and interconnected.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the cycloside rehearsals earlier.
Right.
These structured reviews, how do those fit into this system?
So those structured cyclical reviews, or TCRs, are designed to strengthen those neural pathways over time, leading to much better long-term retention.
So it's like intentionally revisiting and reinforcing those brain pages that have been formed.
Exactly, yeah.
Making those connections stronger and more durable.
Yeah, and then there's this really innovative idea called the miniature school model. And I think this is fascinating.
Yeah, tell me about that.
So it's essentially a small learning group, a micro school, of around 7 students within the larger classroom setting. And the goal here is to encourage collaborative peer-to-peer learning, where students naturally take on more leadership roles and responsibility for each other's understanding.
Interesting.
And in this model, the teacher's role shifts from being the primary lecturer to more of a task moderator and facilitator, guiding the learning process, but empowering the students to teach and learn from each other.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I'm curious, wouldn't there be challenges in managing these smaller groups within the context of a larger classroom?
Yeah.
How does the article address potential issues, like some students dominating or others not participating?
Well, it suggests that the teacher's role as facilitator is really crucial here. Setting those clear expectations, structuring tasks in a way that encourages participation from everyone, and providing guidance and support as needed. The small group size itself helps to foster more interaction and accountability. And, think about how much you learn when you actually have to explain something to someone else.
That's true.
That's a key benefit of this peer teaching approach. It shifts the learning dynamic from that traditional top-down model to a more collaborative and distributed one.
I like that.
which interestingly mirrors how knowledge is often shared and reinforced in online communities.
Yeah.
Including gaming communities.
Right.
And speaking of gaming,
yeah,
the article draws some really interesting parallels and suggests applying some of the elements that make digital games so engaging to academic learning.
So what are some of those key elements?
So, as we've discussed, games are great at providing that immediate and consistent feedback.
Yes.
They offer challenges that gradually increase in difficulty.
Yeah.
Keeping those players engaged. They encourage lots of experimentation through trial and error.
Yeah.
It's okay to fail and try again.
Right.
There's often a really strong emotional connection driven by narrative and the sense of accomplishment. And players typically have a lot of control over how they progress through the game.
Okay, so how can we take these engaging elements and apply them in a classroom or learning environment?
Well, the article suggests designing these more interactive learning experiences, giving students more choice in what they learn and how they approach those challenges. Imagine using something like brainpage scoreboards to visualize progress and mastery rather than just focusing on grades. And really emphasizing task-based learning that connects to real-world applications so that can make the learning feel much more relevant and meaningful.
I like that.
And the ultimate aim, it seems, is to tap into that flow state that gamers often experience. That feeling of being completely absorbed and focused and make learning as intrinsically addictive and rewarding as playing a really compelling game.
That's the goal.
So it's about taking those same psychological principles that game designers have really mastered and applying them to create these more effective and engaging learning experiences.
And so to bring it all together, the central message is that students aren't inherently passive.
Right.
The article makes a strong argument that they're often conditioned into passivity by these outdated educational systems that don't really align with how our brains naturally learn and stay engaged.
Yeah. And the promise of brainpage theory and system learnography is this potential to create this happiness classroom, a learning environment that nurtures self-driven, self-directed, and ultimately self-modified learners.
I love that.
Mirroring that active engagement that they already demonstrate in other areas of their lives, like gaming.
Right.
So it's about transforming learning from something that feels like a chore into this joyful and effective process.
Exactly. So for you, the listener, the core insight here is that the very principles that captivate you in those moments of deep focus, that feeling of autonomy, the right level of challenge, immediate feedback on your efforts, active participation, these are the same crucial elements that can unlock your own potential for self-driven learning in any academic pursuit, or even when trying to master a new skill. And this idea of a brain page, that tangible neurological trace of learning that's created through active engagement. That's the real outcome we're aiming for.
That's it.
And so with that in mind, here's a final thought for you to consider. Think about those areas in your own life where you experience that intense focus and engagement. What are the specific elements of those activities that really hold your attention? How might you consciously apply those same principles to learning new things or deepening your understanding in other areas? Could you proactively design your own learning environment, whether it's for a new hobby or a professional skill that fosters that brain page development and supports your own self-directed growth?
It's a really interesting thought experiment.
It is. And the article mentions the Taxshila Page and learnography as resources if you're interested in exploring these ideas further. And it really encourages us all to rethink the classroom.
Absolutely.
And even our own individual approaches to learning. To truly build brain pages, not just grades.
It's such a compelling call to action.
It is.
To bridge that gap between the active gamer and the potential active learner that exists within us all.
I think that's a great note to end on.
I agree.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.